If you read Genesis, you'll likely have read the story of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers and taken to Egypt. But source critics state there were two stories of Joseph being sold into slavery that a later redactor combined into the present form. One claimed Judah prevented his brothers from killing Joseph by selling him to the Ishmaelites. The other claimed the brothers threw Joseph in a pit at the bidding of Reuben, but while they were eating, Midianite traders passed by, drew Joseph up, and sold him as a slave in Egypt. Allegedly, when they were combined, the redactor preserved the two accounts as is, and scholars today are able to reconstruct them, revealing two contradictory accounts of how Joseph ended up in Egypt. But despite how it looks on the surface, there are numerous problems here. Once we dive into the data, the hypothesis Genesis 37 contains two accounts stitched together can no longer be sustained as the most probable explanation. According to the documentary hypothesis, the first account where Judah saves Joseph is assigned to the J source, and the second, where Reuben saved Joseph, is assigned to E. For some scholars, the E story is hypothesized to reflect the theological needs of the northern kingdom of Israel. The J story reflects the needs of the kingdom of Judah. Later on, a redactor combined J and E and merged the two stories. Richard Elliott Friedman theorizes this occurred after the fall of the northern kingdom. Some of the Israelites escaped south, bringing their texts with them, and J and E were combined to unify the remaining people of Israel. The scholar Joel Baden highlights this narrative in his book as one of the best places we can see independent sources stitched together. Although this hypothesis is possible, there are problems with believing Genesis 37 used to be two independent sources. First, with the exception of one issue towards the end, the narrative is coherent. It flows from the brothers' jealousy, to their decision to kill Joseph, to Reuben diffusing the situation, to Judah coming up with an alternative plan. Throughout this section of the narrative, there is very little to suggest the account necessarily contains doublets that must be broken up into different sources. And when we do this, both narratives appear incomplete. There have been various attempts to divide up the passages, but for the purposes of this video, we'll focus more on recent reconstructions advocated for by scholars like Richard Elliott Friedman and Joel Baden. Matthew C. Janung responds to Baden's approach and says it does not lead to complete reconstructed sources. The E source has an abrupt transition from conspiring to kill Joseph to then putting him in a pit. There is no mention of Joseph's arrival or the act of seizing him. These events just happen to be in the J text and align in the unified text where they need to be to fill in this hole in the narrative. The J account has an abrupt transition from Joseph's dreams to his brothers conspiring to kill him. There is no setup of a change in location, where the brothers become separated from their father and Joseph in order for Joseph to go to them so their plan can be carried out. This scene transition just happens to exist in the E text and fill in the narrative details we need. In the E source, Reuben's counterplan to killing Joseph seems arbitrary in suggesting a specific pit. But in the unified narrative, it flows from the brothers' plan to kill Joseph and throw him in one of the many pits in the area. Reuben offers a counterplan, building off of what they initially started with, by suggesting a specific pit close by, which would have allowed Reuben to come back and save Joseph at a later point. The plan allows Reuben to placate his brothers, building off their initial idea, while giving him a chance to save Joseph later on. Earlier in the chapter, the J source has another abrupt change. The text goes from Joseph bringing a bad report of his brothers to their father, to Jacob giving him a special coat. A verse assigned to the E text makes this transition much smoother, because the authors remind us that Israel loved Joseph most of all his children, which transitions more smoothly as to why Jacob made him the coat. It also adds context to the E source. Verse 4 states his brothers saw that his father loved Joseph more. Seeing the coat Joseph had would be what they saw that indicated Joseph was more loved. The text as it is, in the unified narrative, has a much smoother narrative flow that is lacking in hypothesized E and J. It is strange that when the narratives were combined, they just happen to perfectly line up and make a more coherent narrative. Zhedong also notes the unified text explains the actions of Judah more coherently. In the hypothesized J text, Judah abruptly goes from wanting to kill Joseph to deciding against this because he is their kin. This seems like a quick change of heart. The sight of the Ishmaelites explains his other motive for profit, but it does not explain why he suddenly decides the kinship aspect is also important. In the unified text, there is additional time for Judah to cool his temper, being that Reuben first dispels the brothers' plan to directly kill Joseph and have Joseph thrown into a pit, and then we read they sat down to eat, giving time for Judah to calm down and reconsider. At the end of the story, Reuben's outburst of Joseph's disappearance is answered by his brothers coming up with a plan of dipping Joseph's coat in blood. In hypothesize E, they do nothing about Joseph's disappearance and how their father is told is left unanswered. Zhedong says, when Genesis 37 is separated into the proposed sources, they invariably do not amount to complete or coherent narratives. Consequently, lacunae in the sources are filled by conjectured deletions at the arbitrary hand of the redactor. If the redactor did not include all of the material from his sources in order to present a coherent text, why is the product incoherent? If the redactor did not aim to remove incoherencies, why did he not incorporate all of the source material? This hypothesis shows deeper cracks as one grapples with the inconsistencies that arise within the proposed sources between narrative units. Baden suggests there is an unnecessary doublet in verses 18 to 20. We see two statements by the brothers to kill Joseph. But Zhedong notes the passage actually contains a common Hebrew technique, called a proleptic summary, where a command or a plan is recounted by the narrator, where the details are elaborated in the following verses. This recalls the fifth rule of Rabbi Hillel, where a general statement is given and then particulars are elaborated on. We see another example of this right after in verses 21 to 22, which both Friedman and Baden assign to E. Reuben states his plan in general terms and then elaborates in more specific terms. Verses 18 to 20 follow the same structure. Verse 18 is a general statement that the brothers desired to kill Joseph. Then verses 19 and 20 tell us their plan in more specific terms. Zhedong says, the concise statement of verse 18b is subsequently fleshed out and is not a double report of the same event. The only real hole in the plot is that Reuben must have separated himself from his brothers in order for them to be able to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. But Dwayne Garrett says, this hardly creates literary chaos. The reader is apparently expected to surmise that Reuben moved away from the brothers in order to carry out his plan. The account reads quite smoothly. The brothers decide to kill Joseph and cast his corpse into a pit. But Reuben persuades them to put him into a pit alive to die of exposure, thereby avoiding the guilt of having his blood on their hands. Reuben intends to come back alone to rescue Joseph in order to earn the thanks of Jacob. But Judah persuades the brothers to sell Joseph to passing merchants, and thus, when Reuben returns to the pit, Joseph is gone. This shows the narrative prior to verse 27 is more coherent when it is not divided up into different sources. But the main reason source critics claim the text should be divided up is because of verse 27 and 28. Verse 27 has Judah state, "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Verse 28 reads, "Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt." So on the surface, it appears the two verses contradict. In the first verse, Joseph's brothers sell him to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. In the second verse, it seems to indicate that Midianite traders passed by, drew Joseph up, and sold him as a slave in Egypt. This issue is the reason many scholars suggest the text must be divided up between sources. Hugh White calls this discrepancy one of the most certain contradictions in the entire Pentateuch. Joel Baden says, the Ishmaelite-Midianite problem is the driving force behind the need for literary analysis of the chapter. But Dwayne Garrett responds, the presence of one single discrepancy does not require or justify such an extravagant explanation. This is especially true given that when we divide the text up, it creates holes in the narrative that coincidentally are solved when we combine them into the unified text. Other scholars suggest that a later redactor is the one who added to the text, which created this discrepancy. The redactor understood Ishmaelites as also being Midianites, and so added context to the passage so his audience would understand who was involved. But if it was known to a redactor that the Ishmaelites and the Midianites could be understood to be the same group of people, then the original authors of the passage could have had the same idea in mind, and could have written the passage as is with this understanding that they were using two designators for the same people. In fact, Judges 8:24 seems to indicate that the terms Midianites and Ishmaelites could be used to refer to one people group. So why couldn't the authors of Genesis 37 merely have used two designators for the traders who passed by? Kenneth Kitchen highlights this point that Judges 8 equates Midianites and Ishmaelites, and adds that the pronoun they in Genesis 37:28 refers back to Joseph's brothers, not to the Midianites. In Hebrew, the antecedent of a pronoun is not always the last preceding noun. If this were not so, the phrase, "he has brought an evil name" in Deuteronomy 22:19 would refer to the innocent father. Likewise, the pronouns his and he in Deuteronomy 22:29 go back to the erring other man, and so elsewhere in Hebrew. In other words, the way the text is written in the present form of Genesis 37 would not be stating that Midianites drew Joseph up from the pit, but that Joseph's brothers drew him up and sold him to the Ishmaelite Midianite traders. Rashi said the verb had a remote antecedent and refers to the brothers. In fact, the phrase from verse 27 is similar to what we see in verse 28. It likely could have been understood as a command exhortation fulfillment sequence, similar to what we see in 1 Samuel 11:14-15. We also see places with remote antecedents. Judges 1:20 reads, "And Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the three sons of Anak." The pronoun does not refer to Moses, but to Caleb. Shortly after Genesis 37 in chapter 39 it reads, "His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had." The pronouns refer to his earthly master Potiphar, and not the Lord. So the phrase, "and they drew Joseph up" in Genesis 37:28 can refer to the brothers and not the traders. Joel Baden is aware of this explanation of claiming Midianites and Ishmaelites are two designators for the traders that pass by, and says it's well grounded in the biblical text, but also says, "Yet one might wonder that the Bible draws this equivalence between the two groups only in Judges, rather than at every point where the Ishmaelites or Midianites are referred to. It is especially curious that such an equation is not explicitly drawn in Genesis 37, where without it, as we have seen, confusion reigns." This explanation seems forced into the standard midrashic technique of finding a single verse elsewhere in the Bible, unrelated to the passage at hand, in order to create a reading that eliminates the textual problem. Richard Steiner responds by stating, "This is a surprising argument, especially coming from a source critic, since it seems to assume that the biblical authors were a homogeneous group, that if one of them felt the need to explain something, all of them would or should have felt that same need. There is no reason to think the authors of Genesis had to state what their immediate audience would have already understood, namely that the Ishmaelites and Midianites were understood to be the same people group. It would be like reading in a history book that Americans rebelled against the King of England, and when the war began, the colonists were lacking the arms and supplies they needed. We understand that the author is using two designators for the same group of people. Moreover, Steiner also notes, if citing a proof text from another place in the Bible to better help us understand the Joseph story is midrashic, then every philological commentary ever written is midrashic. Why would it be erroneous to look at another Hebrew text to better understand how the terms were understood in that culture? One can better understand the wariness of Moses to go the way of the Philistines by reading about their warlike nature in Judges in the book of Samuel. One can better understand Genesis 1 by looking at priestly themes in Leviticus and Exodus. One can better understand Israelite religious practices by studying the wider cultural context to eliminate confusion we have about why things were done certain ways. Appealing to another text to better help us understand the terms used in Genesis 37 seems to be standard scholarly practice. Steiner also reminds us there is ambiguity in all languages, which can cause confusion if we do not understand much of the cultural context of the writers. And the Hebrew Bible is no exception. For example, 1 Chronicles 16:3 states that David distributed to all Israel, both men and women, to each man a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. So did David distribute to both men and women, or just the men? The contradiction is illusionary, because the term for man is ambiguous and can also mean each other. 1 Kings 9:22 reads, "But of the people of Israel, Solomon made no slaves. They were the slaves, they were his officials, his commanders, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen." There is no contradiction because the Hebrew word for slave can also mean court attendant. Take Exodus 3:2-3. "Moses looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned." In Hebrew, the first verse says the bush was burning, but the second verse says it was not burning. But the Hebrew root is ambiguous. It can either mean the activity of burning or referring to the achievement of burning up or burning down. Steiner says, "Today many scholars agree that diachronic solutions are superfluous here, because it is not a contradiction to assert that the bush was burning in fire, but not burning up or down." Steiner says these examples demonstrate ambiguity in Hebrew, and so what may seem like a contradiction may not actually be. He argues Genesis 37 should actually be understood to contain something called a prosodic break, after the verb for pass by, which would have been present in an oral presentation of the passage. The discontinuity stems from the fact that Midianite men is not the immediate subject of the verb. Instead, it is parenthetical, standing in opposition to the pronominal affix on the verb. It does not refer to a new group, but because it is derived synchronically from an underlying clause meaning something like, the Ishmaelites turned out to be Midianite men, merchants. What this means is the verb pass by is referring to the activity of the designator Ishmaelites from the prior verse. The phrase Midianite men is parenthetical, so the passage should be understood to say, "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites." His brothers agreed, and so when they, the Ishmaelites, passed by, who turned out to be Midianite men, merchants, they, the brothers, pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. Steiner lists 18 examples where similar structure occurs, supporting the notion this is a regular feature in Hebrew. Moreover, he adds that typically, when an unlikely or surprising change in a story occurs, a phrase like, "and behold" is added, like what we read in places like 1 Kings 13:25. And this is what we see in verse 25. "They looked up and saw, and behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites." If the Midianites were a new and different group in the story, as Baden suggests, it would make sense to render the verse as, "And behold, Midianite traders pass by." But with this word missing, it seems to indicate the phrase Midianite men is parenthetical. Upon closer inspection, they found out they were Midianites, a subgroup of Ishmaelites, or as other scholars have argued, or Midianites intermingled with the Ishmaelites. The absence of a dramatic introduction seems to suggest this is just the same group that the brothers saw from afar. As Robert Longacre said, the text first applies the term Ishmaelites to the caravan seen from afar, and then on closer view calls them Midianite merchants. I would therefore render verse 28a as follows, "And so they passed by, Midianite traders, as they proved to be." Beyond this, within the ancient cultural context, we can see many texts that use multiple terms for one group of people. Kenneth Kitchen says, "Compare the Egyptian stele of Sebeku, who refers to the one general foe of his pharaoh's Palestinian campaign, as Asiatic Bedouin, vile Syrians, and as Asiatics." In the Kadesh inscription, Joshua Berman notes there are two accounts of the same battle. Both accounts list 16 nations that joined the Hittite coalition, but only 14 are common to both. Two differ in both accounts, and neither are written in the same order. Moshe Ambar notes that in a letter from the Mari archives, Hanians and Yemenites are two designators used for one group of people. In Assyrian texts, we sometimes see people groups called by multiple names, and sometimes just as Sutians. Anbar also notes, we see variation in names for people groups within biblical texts. In Judges 6, we hear of the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the people of the east oppressing Israel. But then in verse 7, the oppressors are only called Midianites, suggesting Midianites could be a term for a specific group of people, but also a blanket term for the three different groups. In 1 Chronicles 5, we hear of the war with the Hagrites, but later in the text we were told it was a war with 4 different groups of people. Evidently, the designator Hagrites could be used as a blanket term. In Numbers 32, 2 tribes are named, Reuben and Gad, as wanting the land east of the Jordan River. But at the end of the chapter, we see that this group also included a half-tribe from Manasseh. So the authors didn't think it was necessary to name the half-tribe from Manasseh in the beginning. Dwayne Garrett adds that in Numbers 25, 1-6, Midianite women are operating with the Moabite women. And as we already noted, in Judges 8, the designators Midianites and Ishmaelites are used to refer to the same group of people. All of this indicates that either Midianites were a subgroup of Ishmaelites, or that Midianites intermingled with other groups at times. E.J. Revel even says, the use of the variant designations for a population group or an individual is in fact common in biblical narrative. In this particular case, Midianites is used where the noun is the subject of its clause, Ishmaelites where it is not. So Revel suggests the variation of the terms in Genesis 37 may be a stylistic change, depending on how each designator is used in the sentence. Adele Berlin also remarks, the use of both terms for one entity in subsequent verses can be explained as elegant variation. This would also make sense with the context, because at the end of the passage, we see what appears to be another variant spelling of Midianites. So given the biblical and cultural context, there is no reason to think the authors could not have understood Midianites and Ishmaelites as terms for the same group of traders that passed by. There seems to be no reason to assume the text of Genesis 37 is hopelessly contradictory and must be divided into sources. As Joel Dugnick said, the critic should first take the text as it is, do all possible synchronic analysis, and then add a diachronic dimension to deal with whatever problems remain. We also see that the text appears unified as it is. J.P. Fokelman asked, why does Reuben appear twice? And what is the significance of the fact that he finds the pit empty? There is also a striking repetition. The terrible message that a savage beast devoured him not only occurs in verse 20, but is repeated verbatim in the middle of verse 33. What is the point of that? Everything falls into place once we discover this structure of verses 18 to 33. He notes the chapter as a unified chiastic structure. If there were different sources, it is strange that when they were combined, this structure just happened to form. What appears to be unnecessary repetition of some scholars may have been necessary for reciting the text in an oral performance. Matthew C. Janung notes in Genesis 37, the narrative follows a smooth series of questions and answers, which doesn't make sense when broken up between hypothesized sources. The series of questions posed in Genesis 37 provide one dynamic for the continuation of the narrative. One thing that is not discussed is what happens in the Joseph story after sources have been divided up. There is a lot of focus by source critics on Genesis 37, where it is claimed sources can be reconstructed. But beyond this, the sources have little coherence. If we focus on how Richard Elliott Friedman divides the sources, the alleged J source goes from Joseph being in prison to being in charge over all of Egypt without explanation. It lacks a verse telling us that Joseph let Simeon out of prison when the brothers returned. The E source is highly fragmented. It has no explanation of how Joseph ended up in prison with the cupbearer and baker. When his brothers come to Egypt to buy grain, it goes from them answering Joseph about where they came, from them saying, "But we're guilty over our brother, because we saw his soul's distress when he implored us and we didn't listen. On account of that, this distress has come to us." There is no setup for them to state this. Joseph also puts Simeon in prison for no reason in the E source. Then the narrative jumps to them being back in Canaan, grieving over him. We then see Reuben asking his father to give him Benjamin to take him back to Egypt. And without an indication of a switch in speaker, we see Jacob speaking. Then we jump ahead again to Joseph bringing Simeon out of prison, and then jump again to Joseph revealing his identity to his brothers, and then Israel hearing from God that he should go down to Egypt. The supposed sources after Genesis 37 are fragmented and make little sense. If the Joseph story really is two sources stitched together, why can't we find coherent narratives? Furthermore, there is surprisingly not much assigned to P. In response to Baden, Ben Zion Katz says, Joseph just appears in Egypt and becomes viceroy according to Dr. Baden's presentation of P. In a footnote, he argues that there was a duplicate sentence in J and P, stating that Joseph was taken down to Egypt, the latter of which was deleted. Even granting the existence of this phantom verse in P, there is still no explanation in P of how or why Joseph arrived in Egypt, or of his death, as Dr. Baden acknowledges. In reality, when scholars attempt to divide the Joseph account into 2 or 3 sources, they create narratives that are filled with plot holes and highly fragmented. The narrative flow makes much more sense as it is in the present text. The repetitions can be explained as natural structuring for oral performance and as proleptic summaries. The main reason to divide up the passage has to do with the 2 designators for the passing caravan, and that can be accounted for by understanding how the designator Midianite is used at other places in the Hebrew Bible. There is no reason to think Genesis 37 should be divided up into sources, and more likely was written as it is.